What's good? What's good? What's good? What's good, people? Yo, yo, yo. This is Tony Sway, and I'm back for another live. Know what I mean? So check in, people. Today we're gonna have a discussion about the best R&B albums of the 90s. And I want to see what some of your guys' favorites are as well. So I'm gonna make sure you hit up that chat section as we get into the discussion. If you watch this on the playback, make sure you hit up, the comments and get in those super chats, those super thanks, make sure you like that video, share the video. But yeah, so I'll wait for people to get in. And yeah, how y'all doing today, man? It's your boy T Swizzy. Yeah, but I thought it would be necessary, being that R&B is pretty much my R&B is really my main, really my main thing. It's what I do every day musically, from the beats, from the songs that I record, and my inspiration mostly comes from the mass majority of my inspiration definitely comes from the 90s era, and that, it's the era that I grew up in. So, but, so I'm just going to dive right into it. So some of my most favorite R&B albums of the 90s, there are so many, but I'm going to start off with some of my top picks. So, one of the best, I would say that this album kind of falls into the late 80s. It was, technically it was a 1989 album. So, that Janet Jackson Rhythm Nation, that album, it came out 1989, but much of the singles were actually dropped, much of the singles were actually dropped in the, in 1990 as well. So back then in the 90s, an album could last up to 6, well, usually about 5 years. If you were a really top artist, if you were a top R&B artist back then, sometimes your run would be like 4 or 5 years. Michael Jackson had a 5-year run with Thriller, and a lot of people would, take 2-3 years in between an album because the album they were pushing was so popular. Like, so Janet Jackson, she would have years in between her albums back then because her projects were so massive as far as sales and as far as, airtime on channels like MTV and, BET and VH1 and different things like that. So Janet Jackson's going to be that's definitely in my top 10. So Janet Jackson, Rhythm Nation. Let's discuss, the brilliance of Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis on the Janet Jackson Rhythm Nation album. So check in. Hey, if you guys are watching, check in. If you're just checking in, we are discussing the top 90s R&B albums. So if you have a favorite, make sure you mention it in the chat. I'm going to discuss my favorites, so we're going to go through it. And if I miss something that you like, make sure you mention it in the chat section, and it's all good. So right now I'm discussing the brilliance of the Janet Jackson Rhythm Nation album. So one of my all-time favorite songs from that album, Come Back to Me, maybe the most brilliant ballad ever made in R&B history, as far as just like overall arrangement, bridge, pre-hook, harmony arrangement, the Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis production. They had a live, string section on there. Probably the most brilliant ballad that I could think of in the 90s was, Janet Jackson, Come Back to Me. So that's the standout from the album for me personally. I just think that song is like a master stroke as far as just musical genius. It's Janet at her best. Her vocals were so sincere, are so sincere on that track. And there's several different mixes of that track as well. You got the music video version, you got, the I'm Begging remix. There's a Spanish version of the track as well. And there's a couple other different versions that I've recently just kind of been listening to those ones on YouTube. I was more familiar with, I just had the album growing up, whether I was listening to my aunt's tape, because my aunt had it on tape as well. Shout out to my auntie Mo. She was the first one to own it on tape. And then I later bought it, in the early 2000s when I had a couple dollars. I repurchased a lot of albums, and I listened to that Rhythm Nation from front to back on a regular basis. Still do, but I do it, from Spotify now. A lot of my old CDs a lot of them don't work anymore. They're too scratched up or whatever. So Come Back to Me, just one of the most brilliant tracks ever made in R&B history, period. Just the from front to back, and even the remixes of it, just that arrangement, the da 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 da, just one of the most beautiful melodies. Janet's harmonies are stacked so beautifully and perfectly on the song. They're layered so well. They have just the right amount of reverb on the song. The Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis arrangement, with the chords and with, the guitar plucks throughout the song, and that extra string section going throughout the chorus and the bridge and all that. And it ends with that string. The song ends with the string section playing the outro as well. And, I can't think of too many other R&B songs that can really top the production on Come Back to Me. Just quite possibly, in my eyes, probably one of the most brilliant R&B ballads ever put together, ever. Just the arrangement and just the whole song structure, the way that Janet's vocals sounded across the whole track, the sincerity of the track, the emotion of it. It just never gets old. I can listen to that song every day, several times a day. Specifically, I like listening to it when I'm just, relaxing at night, when I just want to chill. There's something about that song that really just kind of puts you in a zone. And, if you're driving, especially if you're driving at night, there's something about that record that kind of just puts you in a zone. And so, but there's so many other joints on that album in general. The album starts off with the bang. It has, little skits in between. The album has a deep message. I think Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation really is still a relevant album. It has so much to say. Even, it even speaks to excuse me, but I think it speaks to today's problems as well. Like, I just think the message of the album is still relevant. Like, they have a song, she has a song on there called Living in a World Living in a World They Didn't Make. And that song in particular has a really strong message in it that's just still relevant. It's still relevant even today. Even today, that song is still relevant. Beautiful melody, lyrics still relevant to these times, and just amazing. And but my favorite part of the album really is, when it goes to the track Lonely, from Lonely to Come Back to Me. Someday Is Tonight. That's probably my favorite portion of the album, is really that slow jam section. But you can't forget about all the incredible up-tempo dance tracks that are on there as well. So you got Miss You Much, Love Will Never Do Without You. You couldn't go anywhere in the 90s without hearing Love Will Never Do Without You. Like, every time my mom took me to the grocery store, whether, my grandma might, I have a grandma that was from Germany. We call her Oma. And every time my Oma would take me to the grocery store, that was playing in Safeway or whatever it may be. So there's a bunch of, like, great up-tempo records on there as well. Like I said, Miss You Much, Love Will Never Do Without You, Escapade, Get the Knowledge That You Really Want, that record. I'm having a slow down. There's so much great records on that album in particular. Dun, 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 dun. First I was standing by, so she's standing there for a while. That record as well, incredible. And that night be with you, I wanna take to catch my check. Yeah, just all those records. That whole album really, that whole album just was very just really legendary. But my favorite tracks are gonna be Lonely, Come Back to Me are probably gonna be my top tracks from that album. Lonely, another great, the thing about they used to do on the 90s R&B albums is they used to actually, they would make a record that would actually lead into the next song. So the way that they used to master those albums is, an album like that, Lonely perfectly fits into Come Back to Me. So if you listen to those songs back to back on the album, you'll see how they fade into, one fades into the other. It has rain in between each song, and it kind of cross fades into the next song with the rain. And I always thought that was so genius back when people really used to listen to albums. So if you listen to Lonely, Janet Jackson on the Rhythm Nation album, listen to it all the way through, let it play to the end, and then it'll fade out with the rain, and that rain will lead right into Come Back to Me, that was one of the most brilliant transitions I've ever heard. I would say that's probably the most brilliant transition in a master that I've ever heard on an album, is how that song just perfectly fit right into Come Back to Me. And then Come Back to Me kind of basically blends off into the Someday Is Tonight. So the way that Jimmy Jam, Terry Lewis, and Janet Jackson constructed that album was so brilliant. The arrangements, just, brilliance. Everything kind of is just a perfect story that lands into the next record. So that's why Rhythm Nation for me is probably going to be my favorite of, the early 90s. I'm not mentioning the late 80s albums per se. I will do another live talking about my favorite 80s, which I'm going to talk about like In Effect Mode and, Don't Be Cruel, Bobby Brown, and the Michael Jackson records, and, the Vandross records. And, I'll do a separate live about the 80s records, but this particular live, I wanted to focus on everything that was coming out, specifically 1990 and up, and some of the 89 releases as well, because the 89 releases kind of bled into the 90s, because a lot of people that were dropping albums in 1989, their singles kept coming out from that album well into 1990, even till 1991, because back then people used to have albums you could have an album and you could drop literally like 4 to 5 singles on one album, and it would, the album would continue to sell because stuff just lasted longer back then. You were able to market an album for years and literally have it keep selling and keep gaining more and more momentum. A great example is the Ultimate album, Thriller, but I'll talk more about that in the 80s episode. But yeah, so excuse me, I'm like get a drink real quick. Yeah, man. So not many people on right now. I guess none of y'all want to talk about 90s R&B albums, huh? I guess y'all will see me on the playback, but hey, if you love 90s R&B albums, say something. Mention something about one of your favorite albums in the chat, and I'll give you my thoughts. But okay, I'll move on to some more 90s R&B classic records. Let's see. Let's get into another one. So I covered Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation, super classic 90s R&B album. Technically, the release was in '89, but much of the singles came out in the early '90s because they were able to push that album for years because it was so successful. Do your research and you'll see that album, they had singles for days off that album. So, okay, so right now I'm covering the early 90s. We're going to start with the early 90s. So Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation. And really, there's a few albums on this list with her. So another one that I really loved in the early 90s. You can't talk about the early 90s without mentioning, R. Kelly's 12 Play. So 12 Play had a monumental impact on the music scene. And so that's definitely one of my favorite early 90s R&B albums as well. Whether you're talking about Your Body's Calling, or whether you're talking about, just several different records off that particular album. It just was, a classic front to back. And what is there to say? It just, that was a quintessential R&B album of the 90s, really. And it borrowed heavily from, people like groups like Guy, Teddy Riley's production, Aaron Hall's, vocal stylings. And it was really kind of in the spirit of the New Jack Swing, but, R. Kelly was kind of doing something a little bit different. It had the New Jack on there, but it was a little bit, more, it was becoming more progressive and more about the slow jam. That album is all about the slow jam. So whether you're listening to, Your Body's Calling, or you're listening to Seems Like You're Ready, or obviously like Bump and Grind. And one of the best versions of Bump and Grind is, to me, it wasn't even the album version. It was the the remix. I don't see nothing wrong. That remix was actually incredible. Unfortunately, it wasn't on the album that I bought. So you had to buy that on a single back then, because they didn't have Spotify and iTunes back then. So it was a different ballpark. And then I particularly love the ballads like Girl, I'll Be Right There, that record. And of course the Sex Me Baby tracks and all that kind of stuff. There was 1 and 2. So that whole album, man, it was just a great 90s R&B album. And of course it has some up tempos, Homie Love a Friend and all that kind of stuff. But I'm a bigger fan of the slow jams from that particular album. So moving on from that project, we have Jodeci, Forever My Lady. So this is another one of the greatest R&B albums of the 90s, hands down. And Jodeci, I mean, you could really say all three of their, they have 4 albums, actually. They did come out with one in like 2014. But I think all 3 of their albums basically are some of the best 90s R&B albums, really. So Forever My Lady, brilliant production. You got Albie Shore and Devontae on the production. And the standout on that particular album is obviously the slow jams as well. In my opinion, Jodeci they were like the king of the slow jams. They can do up tempos, but me personally, I didn't like the up tempos. Were pretty much of the day. The up tempos is kind of what everybody was doing. So I loved it when they kind of stood on their own mountaintop doing slow jams, because they really stood out when they did the slow jams. The up tempos were cool, but the slow jams is where they really shined. And I think that Devontae understood that, so he kept going in that direction for Jodeci. He kept bringing, a variety of different kind of, sexy type slow jams on their projects. And it really was, to this day is just an absolutely brilliant mix of slow jam, sexy type, slow jams with, church type chords. And, he was putting those, those church type chords in the slow jams and doing all those, diminished chords and stuff. Like he was really bringing it. He brought that, Devontae brought that musicality to his production, kind of like no other producer had really done it quite like that. So when he got together with Al B. Sure, and Al B. Sure had the right equipment and the proper ear to mix, Al B. Sure was able to kind of really bring the best out of Devontae on that first album, and really, help him be the best, really one of the best producers to ever live, with the assistance with him and Al working together. And so whether we're talking about Come and Talk to Me, the title track, Forever My Lady, I'm Still Waiting, Stay, or whether we're talking about, what's another great slow jam, You and I, like all of those tracks, just absolutely incredible. What's good, Glow? Appreciate you. Yeah. Jodeci, there's absolutely Jodeci. I think all three of their first albums are pretty much top album, the top R&B albums of the 90s, really. And obviously, they did have one, obviously, in around 2014, they dropped one. It didn't get the same attention, but the ones that they dropped in the 90s, you couldn't tell them nothing. They were really doing it at the highest level. And Devontae was bringing the absolute best production to the table. His level of musicality, and, the Haley brothers, their raspy, full voice vocals, church-like vocals. But no, I don't think anybody had heard that in the mainstream. Nobody had heard vocals like that in the mainstream quite yet. Nothing quite as rugged as, the Haley brothers. And, and you had Mr. Dalvin and Devontae, and they were all, they were all part of the harmony. They were all harmonizing with, obviously with the Haley brothers as the leads, but, they would all harmonize, and they would stack those vocals in the studio several times. According to like Mr. Dalvin, he would say in some of his interviews how Devontae would have them really stack those vocals to get that monstrous sound. So basically, so nobody was really competing with those kind of harmonies at the time. Nobody really knew how to quite do those type of harmonies, because their harmonies were really powerful. They weren't just smooth. They were very powerful. Like, they were kind of aggressive, and the harmonies were more aggressive, Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. R. Kelly, Aaliyah, Whitney Houston, Jodeci, Brandy. Yeah. So they're those people, they're all on this list of the best R&B albums of the 90s. Absolutely. And Whitney, she's in the 90s and the 80s, and she had she dropped another great album in the early, I think it was that was the late 90s, when she had the Heartbreak Hotel single and all that. And but yeah, Whitney's, rest in peace to Whitney Houston, one of the greatest singers to ever do it in history. And we can't forget the Bodyguard soundtrack. The Bodyguard soundtrack, probably one of the best soundtracks ever made in history. I mean, some of those songs on that Bodyguard soundtrack is just, it really puts you in the zone. So, Run to You, just so many different songs. Like some of the names do escape me, but the melodies are coming up right in my head right now, but some of the names of the songs escape me. But like Run to You, and then I Have Nothing. I don't wanna let it go very much further. I don't wanna have to go where you don't follow. Da 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 da. Run, da, da, da. Can't run from myself. There's nowhere to hide. Don't make me close one more door. Yeah, so yeah, I don't want to, I don't want to offend anybody, but y'all remember that record, right? That's one of the greatest records on the Bodyguard soundtrack. And obviously, I Will Always Love You, which was the lead single from that soundtrack. And that soundtrack went diamond plus, so crazy numbers. Can you believe that ballads back then were really like that when that soundtrack came out, it took over the whole radio. Yeah. So I've been on for about 25 minutes and I was already talking about that 12 play. Yeah. So Kells has several albums on this list. So there's 12 play, but there's also a few others that he has that, again, he kind of came in the 90s and really kind of took over. There was the Kells takeover, really, you know what I mean? So that second album doesn't get enough credit as well. Like You Remind Me of My Jeep. That was always one of my favorite slow jams. Even to this day, I still love that record. And, Keep It on the Down Low with Mr. Biggs of the Isley Brothers. All those are just absolute classics, you know what I mean? So, and then, so obviously, Diary of a Mad Band by Jodeci. Again, Jodeci was just on a run with their R&B albums. So that, they followed up that Forever My Lady with Diary of a Mad Band, and they did not disappoint. They dropped singles like Fiendin', Cry for You, and those two tracks right there, just absolutely incredible. Probably my favorite off that particular album would be Fiendin'. Just an incredible production. It was the first time I heard Devontae on the talk box. So he was using that Roger and Zapp talk box, and he really brought the best out of that, Fiendin', fiendin', fiendin'. Like that talk box sounded so crispy on that song. That's probably my favorite part of the song, is just that, the Devontae part's just really dope, really dope. So I love that. There's so many great 90s R&B albums that I might even have to break up this video, because right now this is kind of just discussing the early 90s, early to mid 90s, but there's so many great 90s R&B albums. I can't forget, Keith Sweat had a lot of great 90s R&B albums as well. So that the album that had Twisted and Nobody, again, you can't forget that. That album has to be, that album has to be on this list. There was just so many hits on there. Nobody was just a huge record. Twisted was a huge record. Some of my favorites off that particular album was, I really love the record Yummy Yum. Super dope record. Just Keith had the ultimate, he had the ultimate slow jams, and you know what I mean? So he had the ultimate slow jams, and he was producing a lot of his records. The production was on point, and it was really amazing. So that's definitely one of the best 90s R&B albums as well. And of course, we can't, forget about Toni Braxton. Toni Braxton, she had some pretty incredible R&B albums in the 90s as well. So she came out with that Breathe Again, Just Another Love Song, so so many great records. Babyface, I know he was behind a lot of the production, and then R. Kelly, I believe R. Kelly wrote the Just Another Love Song. So yeah, just Toni Braxton, she was doing it. Toni Braxton was definitely doing it in the 90s, in the late 90s. She had some great work, some brilliant albums. Yeah, so shout out to Toni Braxton, man. And wow. Mint Condition, they had a really great, R&B album. Obviously, that first project with Pretty Brown Eyes and You Send Me Swangin', those songs in particular, I really love those two records. So, but I won't lie, those are the ones those two records are I'm the most familiar with those records only. So I didn't really know the full album. So I don't know if I can put it on the best albums of the 90s R&B albums, but they definitely had some of the best songs. So I have to familiarize myself a little bit more with those particular albums. They weren't necessarily as popular as some of the other people like the Janet Jacksons and the Jodecis, but they did have two really major songs that kind of ruled R&B radio back then. And Pretty Brown Eyes would probably be their biggest, which I absolutely love that song. Just incredible record, you know what I mean? So let's see some of the other best R&B albums of the 90s. And man, obviously we can't forget about Blackstreet. Blackstreet, their first album had, Before I Let You Go, Booty Call, and just countless other album tracks that I really love. Teddy Riley was doing his thing on the production, and Blackstreet kind of came through with that Jodeci vibe, and hey, they delivered some amazing material, and that first album is probably my favorite. The second album had the bigger hits, but that first album was my favorite. Specifically, I like the album track I Want to Make Love. It wasn't a single, but that was probably my favorite off the album. Just an incredible album. They had records like Joy, Before I Let You Go, I Like the Way You Work, and just that whole album was absolutely incredible. So that make sure y'all check out that first Blackstreet album. Absolutely incredible work. Teddy Riley's production was at its finest. So one of my absolute favorite albums from the 90s. So what else? There's so many albums I'm probably going to forget. I know I'm forgetting something because the 90s were like full of amazing R&B albums. I'll mention one that's more of this album was a more radio friendly. It was more geared towards radio, which was that first TLC album. That first TLC album was incredible as well. So, you had the mix of the R&B and hip hop, and the New Jack Swing was like really heavy on that album. They had Dallas Austin was doing a lot of the production, if not the majority. So records like Ain't Too Proud to Beg, What About Your Friend, great like up-tempo R&B and hip hop. Really the beats were hip hop, and then they had the R&B vocals with T-Boz and Chili. Chili would really kind of take the the she would really deliver that strong R&B vocal. Then T-Boz had that that raspy kind of more gritty R&B vocal, and then obviously rest in peace Lisa Left Eye Lopez. She brought the attitude to the group and much of the swag, you know what I mean? So my favorite record off that particular album is actually a Babyface production. So Baby, 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 produced by Babyface. Baby, 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 I got so much loving. That's one of my favorite records, and it has that amazing bridge / pre-hook. As long as you know that I can have anything I want to. Baby, that's actual and factual, but still I choose you to be with me, and I'm done and then I flake it up. Oh, no, no, no. My voice done cracked. But yeah. Baby, 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 TLC, incredible. Love that first TLC album. And that second TLC album, again, late 90s for that second TLC album. Absolutely incredible. The second album had, Don't Go Chasing Waterfalls was one of the biggest singles. But my favorite song off that particular album was actually a song produced by JD, Jermaine Dupri, Kick Your Game. Kick Your Game. I love that record. It was like super hard beat. Dope, it had, this dope rap from, Lisa Left Eye Lopez, and, T-Boz's vocals are on point. And Chili's vocals are all sultry. And so I love that record, Kick Your Game, off the second TLC, Crazy, Sexy, Cool. And then, of course, the record Creep. Creep is another classic record off of the second TLC album. Red Light Special, another, obviously Babyface was doing a lot on that album. So Red Light Special. And then, man, just so many records on there, really. What's good? I appreciate you. He's my shepherd. I appreciate you. God bless you as well. If you're just joining this discussion, hey, we're just chatting it up about some of the best 90s R&B albums, some of the best 90s R&B albums from that time. And if you guys, if I haven't mentioned something that you love, mention it in that chat. And because there is so many great 90s R&B albums, and some people won't make the list because maybe they just were more of a one hit wonder. But I'm gonna mention some of the songs. Maybe the full album wasn't as dope, but sometimes people just had those one or two hits. But I gotta mention some of those people because some of those songs were just too good not to mention as well. So if you're just tuning in, make sure you get your super thanks in. I appreciate any kind of super chat donation. You could, or if you can't donate, you can definitely add a like to the video, like and share the video, or you can simply go to tonyswaymusic.com and get yourself a bunch of beats. I got buy one, get 19 free on all my beat leases, as low as $50. So I appreciate everybody for joining in. And so let's get right back into it. Let's see, another great R&B album of the 90s. This album gets slept on. How many of you remember Jade? Who remembers the R&B group Jade? Jade. Anybody in the chat remember the R&B group Jade? Come on. I know somebody remembers that group. They have the that one song that was like really big back then. Don't walk away. My love won't hurt you. So yeah, that's the group Jade. Their album was super dope. They had that record, and then they had another record called Love You Down that was I wanna love you. I wanna love you down. Right down to the part. I wanna love you. I wanna love you down. And that was super, like that song was super dope. It kind of had the Color Me Bad feel to it with the yeah. So that was one of my favorite R&B albums. I had that on tape when I was really young, you know what I mean? So I was bumping that. And they had a couple other joints on that particular album as well. They had a song called Only One Woman, Don't Walk Away, I Wanna Love You. Those three records were kind of like the standout singles from that album. So definitely one of the great 90s R&B albums for sure. So who else we got? I didn't mention I'll Be Sure and Bobby Brown because I'm going to include them on my 80s. They're more so the 80s. Because I'll Be Sure and Bobby Brown, they dropped 88. So I gotta do a different live talking about the 80s R&B albums. But shout out to Al and Bobby Brown. Let's see, what else is some of the other, I'm gonna go through my list of some of my other favorites as well. So wow, there is just so many. There's probably a lot of people that I'm forgetting because I'm just going off the top of the dome. So there's definitely a lot of people that I'm probably forgetting, unfortunately. So, but yeah. But man, let's see. But yeah, so some of the other, man, let's see, what other albums did I really admire from that time? I gotta mention Groove Theory. Maybe not the album as a whole, but really those first two singles, I really loved Tell Me and keep your head to the sky and keep trying, believe in you and it will take you higher. So that single, and obviously Tell Me If You Want Me To, if you want my love, wanna make it good for you, 'cause you blow my mind up. So those two records was definitely like getting a lot of play in my house growing up. More so because my mom was playing it. I was a little young. I was playing more hip hop at that time because I was pretty young then, but those grew to be some of my favorite records of all time. And of course, you can't mention the 90s without mentioning Aaliyah. Aaliyah, pretty much all her albums are just some of the greatest 90s R&B pretty much some of the greatest 90s R&B albums ever made, hands down. So of course you got the first one, you had At Your Best, one of the most beautiful, R&B songs ever. It was obviously a remake of of a Isley Brothers song, just the absolute incredible, song. And, back and forth, and you know what I mean? Obviously she had the highly controversial, relationship with R. Kelly. I won't speak on that, but I'm just going to focus on the music and respect her legacy, because we absolutely miss Aaliyah. So rest in peace, Aaliyah. Truly gone too soon. But her music lives on, and that first album was incredible. That second album was incredible as well. The second album obviously introduced Timbaland and Missy Elliott on the writing and Timbaland on the beats. One in a Million, a super insane track. If your girl only knew, incredible track. 4-Page Letter, incredible track. You know what I mean? So Aaliyah was really on. She was really on it. She was really putting down great songs, great music videos, and a really good image as well. She was a very, very positive, a very good image for people to look up to, especially young women. She had a really good image, very positive. She was like a straight A student. She was a great role model, to be honest with you. Back in the 90s, she was kind of a quintessential role model for young women and everything. So shout out to Aaliyah, and rest in peace to Aaliyah. We appreciate you, and we definitely miss you, and so much love to Aaliyah, and absolutely. But yeah, I couldn't mention 90s R&B albums without mentioning Aaliyah's first two albums. Really, I think that last album, that was maybe the early 2000s, to be honest. But the first two was obviously in the 90s. But yeah, so what else? There's so many R&B albums that I haven't mentioned. We got some of the biggest ones out of the way, but there's so many great R&B albums of that time that I want to reflect on, and really, just really give, shout those albums out. Obviously, you can't forget about Ginuwine's first couple albums. He came through with a lot of hits. He had just a lot of hit records, to be honest. And yeah, he had a lot of great songs from that time. Obviously Pony being like probably the biggest one to really smash radio. Just a lot. Same Old G. And obviously these are few different albums, but pretty much whatever he released in the 90s was pretty amazing. You know what I mean? So shout out to Ginuwine. If I had to pick a favorite song from the 90s from him, wow, that would be tough. That's kind of tough. I would probably go with, if I had to choose my favorite Ginuwine record from that time. Wow. That's a tough one because he had so many. I don't know. That's a tough one to really choose because he had so many hits. But wow, I don't think I can really choose because he had so many hits. So that's a difficult one. Very difficult. I'll come back to that. I'll have to come back to that. But wow. So yeah, there's just so much from the 90s that I'm forgetting, to be honest. It's getting a little late, so I'm kind of forgetting. I covered some of my favorite ones, but there's a lot more than what I mentioned. So, wow. Obviously, we can't forget about, like, Guy. They came out with the album that had the Let's Chill on it. No, let's chill, let's settle down. That's what I want to do. Just me and you. So, that second Guy album was officially, I think that was released either 89 or 1990, but incredible album. Let's Chill, Smile, and just a quintessential 90s R&B album. You know what I mean? So shout out to Teddy Riley. Yeah, shout out to Teddy Riley, man. Teddy Riley was doing it. Wow. Oh yeah. Okay. I'm gonna mention one more, and then I'm gonna get off stream. But one of the best R&B albums of the 90s is hands down SWV. It's About Time. My God, that's just one of the best R&B albums, hands down, of the 90s. I'm almost mad that I didn't mention it earlier, but records like Weak, I'm So Into You, the title track, Downtown, and then of course the Michael Jackson sampled version of Right There. Love will be right here, be right here. So, like, man, the SWV, that first album, was an absolute smash, absolute incredible work. So shout out to SWV. They have one of the best R&B albums of the 90s, hands down. So you can't mention R&B albums of the 90s without shouting out SWV, because their first album is an absolute smash. One of the best albums of one of the best 90s R&B albums of all time, really. So just absolutely incredible. So shout out to SWV. Weak, So Weak in the Knees. Da, 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 da. Yeah, just that, even the keys, even that DX7 electric piano, chord playing, it just absolutely amazing. And Coco, her churchy vocals, and then the way that the girls came in and harmonized with her, just amazing. The bridges in that song, I try hard to fight it, no way can I deny it. Your love so sweet, it knocks me on my feet. Like, just absolutely incredible vocals. Incredible. They just don't do it. They just don't do songs like that anymore, to be honest. Incredible bridge, incredible pre-hook on there. 'Cause my heart starts beating triple time. Like, just incredible arrangement. The song arrangement, I believe it was produced by Brian Alexander Morgan. So just incredible arrangement on the song. Incredible. So shout out to SWV, and obviously the Michael Jackson remix with the Love Will Be Right Here. It was on that a soundtrack called Free Willy. Who remembers that movie back in the day? But SWV, man, I'm gonna end the stream with one of the best albums. So wow, you know, shout out to SWV. And one, I forgot to mention another one. Got to mention John B's Cool Relax. Definitely one of the best R&B albums of the 90s, hands down. They Don't Know. They Don't Know was one of the best singles of the late 90s for R&B. Just an absolutely amazing arrangement produced by Tim and Bob. Incredible pre-hook. And you know, the intro, the pre-hook, you're my angel, just incredible arrangements. John B's harmony, and just, you know, the song's very heartfelt song. It was relatable. A lot of people can relate to that topic. And, you know, a lot of people have friends that hate on their man or that type of thing. So it's very relatable. And so shout out to John B. And another notable mention would be Tamia's first album. So Tamia had an incredible first album. It had records like So Into You, which was sampled so many other times by plenty of other artists, including a remake, obviously, that Fabulous did a remake that features Tamia. And so that song kept coming back and was able to become a hit multiple times, to be honest. So Into You, and Rain on Me was another great record from that album. Wow. You Put a Move on My Heart, another great record from that album. And just Tamia she was really doing it in the 90s. Her music was definitely on point. And so shout out to Tamia, man. But I'm going to end the stream on that note. So if you guys appreciate what I do, make sure you get in those super chats. Super thanks to, you know, keep this channel growing and keep going with, you know, these live streams. And so I can also put out more beats for you. And just, you know, I want to keep putting out more content and take it to the next level as I do more content for everybody. So if you catch me on the playback, make sure you mention what some of your favorite R&B albums are from the 90s. And if you appreciate this content, simply just drop your boy Tony Sway a super chat. I really do appreciate it. So God bless y'all. I got a bunch of beat deal specials at tonyswaymusic.com right now. So make sure you check in with me. One love. Holla.